Edwin Land turned 35 in May 1944 as the tide of World War II was about to turn, following the D-Day invasion of Normandy a few weeks later. His newborn company would earn over $13 million that year, approximately $176 million in 2014 dollars. His company's contributions to the war effort were widely recognized. One of his colleagues in the Academy of Sciences characterized Land as a commanding and effulgent presence in the world that was emerging from the war against Hitler. Yet, for all that success, Land was troubled about the future of his company. His polarizing technology, so successful in military applications, had not yet established a substantial beachhead in the civilian sector. The use of polarizers for sunglasses and optical instruments proved to be the most viable commercial applications. Polaroid would remain in that technological niche for many years. It was, however, clearly not enough. Land continued to work on making three-dimensional motion picture technology attractive to the major studios, but did not make any progress until, seemingly out of nowhere in the 1950s, Hollywood produced a slew of films in a short period using the technology. At one point, more than 50 productions were in the works, with an average of 7 three-dimensional productions being filmed every week. Polaroid was also reportedly manufacturing 12 million pairs of disposable polarizing eyeglasses a month and selling them to movie theaters nationwide. Total sales were around 100 million pairs. This helped the company make a profit in 1953 of an estimated $26 million, $232 million in 2014 dollars. Unfortunately, the demand for three-dimensional movies ceased as quickly as it had begun. Land's goal of getting Detroit to adopt his anti-glare technology remained beyond his reach. The automobile companies considered it too expensive, too impractical, and arguably unnecessary. He did not give up easily, however. As Land later admitted, "I was too young, too romantic to stop." After the war, in an attempt to renew his campaign to encourage the public to demand improved safety, Land participated in a demonstration of his system by the Automobile Manufacturers Association. According to a report in the New York Times, this test of the polarized headlights indicated their potential worth. However, General Motors staged its own elaborate 13-hour program to convince the public that the adoption of polarization was not necessary. No one from Polaroid was present at this event, and one journalist who did attend characterized it as General Motors' attempt to do a snow job on polarized headlights. Despite General Motors' argument against the desirability of using this technology, some observers nevertheless thought the Polaroid system passed all the extensive tests on General Motors' proving grounds. The industry, however, continued to resist, and in early December, General Motors claimed that the highway glare problem was overstated, urging that further surveys be conducted to assess the actual extent of the problem. This was part of the industry's strategy to resist adopting polarizing technology by subjecting it to the deliberations of an unending series of boards and surveys and other bureaucratic dead ends. Later that month, Land made a presentation to the Highway Research Board, a quasi-governmental group organized in 1924 to provide independent advice to the President, Congress, and federal agencies on science and technology issues affecting transportation. He described the advantages of his system and estimated the cost to manufacturers as only $7 per vehicle. If manufacturers wanted to pass the cost along to the consumer, they could probably charge $30 to $80. Land was convinced that the automobile industry exaggerated the cost and minimized the benefits of his system. If you will look back over the history of important new improvements that we now take for granted in our day-to-day life, you will find, I believe, that each was introduced for obvious and overwhelming reasons, but that at the same time each of these improvements presented a number of minor disadvantages which may have seemed significant at the time the change was proposed, but which we have now come to disregard. You will also find that the minor disadvantages have been balanced by a number of minor advantages to which little attention was given when the improvement was introduced. If pressed, I am sure we could all point out a number of minor disadvantages of such overwhelming improvements as the telephone, the electric light, or even the automobile. All of us could at the same time point out a great many minor advantages of these improvements beyond the obvious ones. This, I believe, will prove true of the Polaroid headlight system. Despite Land's impassioned arguments, J.H. Hunt, a representative of the auto industry, characterized the figures Land had presented to the Highway Research Board as wholly unrealistic. Although he acknowledged that a workable set of headlights had been developed in a partnership between General Electric and Polaroid, he stated unequivocally that the industry was opposed to its introduction at this time due to serious questions as to its usefulness and the added risk for drivers of cars not so equipped. As Land ultimately recognized, the adoption of his system was fatally hampered by the fact that there was no competitive advantage for any car company in using it first. Since all cars needed to incorporate the technology as simultaneously as possible, it was either going to be all, either voluntarily or as directed by the government, or none. No state or federal governmental agency ever stepped in to direct the adoption of the technology in the way that seatbelts would be required decades later. Herbert Nichols, a journalist with the Christian Science Monitor who had followed the story, believed that the industry killed the idea, even though the demonstrations clearly showed that the system worked. According to Nichols, the industry concluded that it just didn't need anything to sell automobiles. They realized they could sell all the automobiles they could make. Thus, with no economic or competitive incentive, why bother with a system that clearly added costs and admittedly presented implementation issues? After more than 2 decades, Land reluctantly gave up the fight. But he learned one very important lesson. I knew then that I would never go into a commercial field that put a barrier between us and the customer. Rather than deal with other companies as intermediaries, he would market his innovative products directly to the public. He believed that the role of industry is to sense a deep human need, then bring science and technology to bear on filling that need. Any market already existing is inherently boring and dull. Land, like Steve Jobs many decades later, believed that his company should give people products they do not even know they want. Fortunately, he already had such a product in mind. Toward the end of 1943, Land joined his family in Santa Fe, New Mexico for an early December vacation. As the war approached its conclusion, he knew that Polaroid could not rely on sales of sheet polarizer to sustain it, much less grow it. Land needed to find a new way to exploit his organization's intellectual capital and entrepreneurial energy. When he arrived in Santa Fe, there was none in sight. Then came the epiphany. Why? His daughter asked. Did she have to wait weeks to see the photographs her father had taken of her? Land, during the course of a long, solitary walk, decided on the challenge that would ignite Polaroid's creativity, the development of a camera that will make a picture right away. Within the hour, the camera, the film, and the physical chemistry became so clear that with a great sense of excitement I hurried to the place where a friend was staying to describe to him in detail a dry camera which would give a picture immediately after exposure. Serendipitously, Donald Brown, also on vacation in Santa Fe, was the friend Land sought out. Years later, Land recalled that his conception was so real that he spent several hours on this description. As his patent attorney listened, Land was able to construct the whole scheme and define all the variables. It was a delightful scientific problem. Brown's reaction was to make sure that Land's idea was immediately memorialized so as to establish a firm date of conception. He had long ago convinced Land how important it was to protect intellectual property by filing a well-documented patent application, which is why in 1940 Polaroid established a department to keep tabs on all technological developments in the company. This collection of written disclosure documents was the foundation upon which a program was organized to patent whatever came out of Polaroid's ongoing research in a vast number of areas, including Land's special new venture. Within days, Land returned to Cambridge. Brown asked his new associate, Charles McCulloch, who had joined Polaroid in 1942, to supervise the process. On December 16th, McCulloch had Land disclose everything to him in detail. McCulloch recorded the event in longhand on a legal-size pad. The rudimentary disclosure has the basic elements of the camera and film process that would take Land and his team the next 3 years to perfect. A photosensitive negative, a container of developer reagent, a positive print, and a pair of rollers to release the reagent from its container and spread it between the negative and the positive. In his handwritten memorandum, McCulloch articulated the generic elements of the concept in more legalistic patentese. The novel film comprises a photosensitive layer and material for developing the latent image produced in said layer upon exposure, which may comprise a silver halide in gelatin, and the self-development of each exposed frame may be effected by having one or more containers filled with developer secured to or formed with each film frame. Means are provided in the camera, for example, pressure rollers, for releasing the developer after exposure of each frame. The developed photosensitized layer acts to form the positive print, which is stripped from the remainder of the film, preferably on a suitable backing sheet. Land signed the document on December 28, 1943. During the same period, Mikulka collected from two other Land colleagues evidence of the disclosures Land had made to them. On December 23rd, one of Land's laboratory associates, Frederick Binda, wrote a memorandum to Mikulka reporting that, on December 13, 1943, Mr. E. H. Land called me to one side and said he had a secret to tell me about a new photographic camera in which you simply photograph a subject, and from that same camera roll comes out a finished picture.